Hello. In this clip from our Justia webinar, Logic for Lawyers, Crafting Persuasive Legal Arguments, Ryan McCarl shares his final takeaways and answers the audience's questions regarding crafting legal arguments. If you want to see more Justia videos on law practice and legal marketing, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ryan. We will move on to audience questions as he said. So if you have any questions for him, looks like we've already got a few we can dive into. But just a reminder, if you'd like to submit them, please feel free to do so by clicking the Q&A button in the control panel at the bottom of your screen and submitting there. All right. You want to go ahead and get started, right?
Absolutely. Okay. The first question I'll summarize as being that can conclusory statements helpfully function as introductions? And I think that can be true to a point. It's just that the reason I recommend a point heading being conclusion plus best reason rather than just the conclusion is that it can foreshadow where you're going and prime the reader to start thinking about that best reason. Oftentimes it will be kind of self-evident from the motion or the brief, what's on the cover page, what you're going to get at as far as broad conclusions. If it's a motion for summary judgment or a motion to dismiss, let's take that example, then you're aiming to the broad conclusion that the plaintiff's complaint, even taken as true, doesn't state a claim. So if you just formulate it at that high level of generality, that could work as an introduction, but it's not as strong, in my opinion, as previewing the best reasons. Now, that said, you can start with a broader, it's perfectly acceptable to start at a higher level of generality and work your way down. I just think it's helpful also to foreshadow what your best reason is. The next question was, can I say more about why I don't like IRAC? Sure. So the first is that it doesn't help you answer the question of fighting about the legal premises or the fact premises, and that's kind of where most of the action happens in contested motions. It's also sometimes can turn into kind of formulaic prose that just kind of plods and doesn't. It can kind of actually encourage conclusory writing because of the fact that it doesn't tell you how to support premises. As far as a writing structure, starting with an issue, to me doesn't make a lot of sense because the issue is always going to be whether a certain conclusion is correct. So the issue can be, the issue can always be just stated as the conclusion or inferable from the conclusion. And then as for CREAC, which I think is taught more commonly these days in law school, I don't follow why you would need to say the conclusion both at the beginning and the end. I don't think you want to just trail off, as I say in the book, but the reader shouldn't lose the thread of your argument and what you're aiming at by the time you get done with that particular argument. That should still be in their head. And if it's not, then you probably have a bigger organizational problem or need to condense the argument so that they don't forget what you're talking about. Also, the other thing about CREAC is that the E in the middle, the rule explanation, it tends to lead to one of the biggest, most common flaws I see in legal writing, which is overemphasis on rule statements and overlong rule statements. I've seen oppositions to motions to dismiss, for example, where because because it's hard to satisfy the standard for the defendant, you'll find the plaintiff going on for 3 pages about the 12b6 standard, even though every federal judge has mastery of those rules, and the rules by itself don't tell you whether this particular motion meets the standard. So it kind of conclusorily implies that because the standard is difficult, then surely this defendant hasn't met it. That kind of just postpones the argument. So that's why I don't like the E in the middle of CREAC, because I think that simple rules or straightforward rules don't need to be explained. They can often just be asserted and backed by, one citation, and the explanations become necessary if it's contested and the contest is strong. Okay, strategies for organizing and prioritizing the rules most relevant to your case. We think in my litigation practice, we think about trial and, what's going to go on those verdict forms and jury instructions from day one. What are the elements of a claim? If a claim's elements are at a high level of generality, then you're going to dig in and find, add a little bit more meat to them by figuring out what not just that you have to prove lack of good faith, but what kind of factors have courts considered in saying that there's good faith or not in a certain context. And once you identify what the kind of rule conditions are that lead to the outcome you're looking for, what needs to be proved to get there, then you want to find backing for each of the rule conditions, and you're going to find factual backing from discovery and legal backing from legal research. So you're just working backward from what you'll eventually have to prove on the assumption that the case is going to be tried and end up with a jury in a room looking at a verdict form. Estimate on when the new book will be published. I have a 1-year-old daughter and a thriving trial practice, and I'm promoting the book that came out in February. So don't hold your breath. It's going to be a while. But that said, I'll be, the reason, for example, that I picked this topic for today's webinar is to force myself to move it forward. And I'm going to continue doing that. So if you follow me on the blog and social media, you'll see it coming out in dribs and drabs. But the next book itself, hopefully will be released, in the next few years. As far as the next question, which was, how do you weigh the persuasive and authoritative value of legal authority? So I would point you to my book, Chapter 8, which is called Using Legal Authority, which includes a section on the hierarchy of authority where I propose a ranking. But you can't get around statutes, contracts, the Constitution. Oftentimes those will need to be augmented by interpretation rules of some kind. But once the ordinary meaning of them has been determined, it's hard to get around them. But then, assuming that you're not dealing with an interpretation issue like that, then your best bet, it will always be in jurisdiction cases that are judicial opinions that are published, that remain good law, haven't been superseded, that are decided in a similar procedural context to the current motion, and that have similar analogous facts, are not easily distinguished, and that the motion ends with a ruling in your client's favor. Always check that last part, because it's always fun when the other side cites a case and relies on a case, and what it turns out is that they're relying on dicta, and then when you go read the case, which you should always do, you find out that actually your side won. So now you can go ahead and appropriate that case for your own argument. It's a little more reason to read the cases and not, delegate completely to somebody junior, or to, God forbid, an AI program. These things can only be starting points for your research, not the end of it. And reading cases is an underappreciated art, just like reading in general. There's a question about speaking indictments as they relate to filing of a complaint in civil practice. I think I'm going to interpret that as talking as potentially meaning how detailed should factual allegations be in a complaint. The modern trend, as led by the Supreme Court of the United States, and visible in particular in the Twombly case followed by the Iqbal case for dealing with adequacy of pleading under Federal Rules of Civil Procedure 8A, is that you have to allege more evidentiary facts, more facts that are intelligible and not just bare conclusions, and that they have to be plausible. That's the modern trend, and it fits well with my own philosophy of writing complaints and writing legal documents in general, which is to make them interesting to read. So take the salient evidence, put it front and center for the court, right in your complaint. So our complaints will go into much more greater detail than is typical, and we'll take some of our best evidence and we'll put it right there in a screenshot or right in the complaint. My law firm is lead counsel, for example, in a class action against the makers of Stanley Cups up in Seattle, and we have it's a false advertising case or deceptive advertising case. So we have a QR code that leads to an Instagram, to an Instagram influencer doing an advertisement that we say is deceptive, and we routinely use visual aids of that kind in our filings. So I do believe in generally including more factual detail in your complaint, so you could tell a coherent story right from the beginning. Other than my book, what are the legal writing and reasoning books that I most highly recommend? The ones that I mentioned in my slide, I would say on the legal reasoning side, I haven't found a go-to book on legal reasoning that I think is, that is I can sort of wholeheartedly recommend as the answer on that one. Probably the closest, but it's a little bit abstract, is a book called How to Do Things with Legal Doctrine that somebody on LinkedIn pointed me to earlier this year. But as far as legal writing, I have a recommended reading list at the back of Elegant Legal Writing. I've been heavily influenced by Gruberman, also by Brian Gardner. Some of what's in Elegant Legal Writing is synthesizing past work done by them, by others, and I also draw on ideas from cognitive science and also pro-style books from outside the law, the sort of thing that you'd read in a book about how to write fiction or how to write poetry, for example. So I talk about rhythm, emphasis, things like that. Some of the particular books I'd recommend, I mentioned The Art of Advocacy and Point Made. I like Garner's book, The Winning Brief, Modern English Usage. I like the Red Book. And there are some others as well. But I take a look at the recommended reading in Elegant Legal Writing. And what tips? Another question is, what tips do I have to make your briefs more lively on the page? And I just provided a couple with visual aids as being an example. Choosing salient facts and salient evidence, removing extraneous details is crucial. Being concise, and then the fiction writing or literary writing concept of pace is helpful to keep in mind. So if you think about the devices used by popular writers, short paragraphs, a sense of suspense, these things can be borrowed by legal writers as well to just kind of write in a way that is within the norms of the profession, but not necessarily boring. Nobody said it had to be boring, just because most are. So I take a look at my at Elegant Legal Writing, and in particular their chapter, I think 9, which is called Legal Storytelling. That's about how that brings in some of those techniques about how to write compelling narratives. What do you do when a court indicates it wants to change the rules? This isn't, and then the example being the Supreme Court. It's just not really a situation too often encountered in practice by litigators. You usually have to convince the judge or panel of judges on appeal that the outcome you want is mandated by the current set of rules. If you're in a position of having to argue for a change, the most fruitful situation when that's happening is when you're a part of a legal advocacy group, like, I don't know, the ACLU or the Institute for Justice or Center for Reproductive Rights, whoever it may be, Lambda Legal. They have the flexibility to kind of bring impact litigation to try to move the law in a certain direction. But for those of us doing day-to-day civil litigation, the rule always is going to have to be that you're going to apply is not overturn your peer court, a different panel, not overturn the Supreme Court, not change the law, because that's just a guaranteed way to lose the motion. And if you win, it'll be a Pyrrhic victory because it'll eventually likely get overturned if it's clear that that's what the judge did. So find a way to formulate your outcome you want and the rule you want within the current set of available rules whenever possible. And if you can't, then settle the case. Where can people see examples of my legal writing other than the book? So I do have examples of Rushing McCarl LLP's writing. And I believe, let me just test it real quick, but I do have, I will, I'll probably just I'll test the link and I'll put it on LinkedIn after this meeting. So if you check my LinkedIn page, you'll see a link to a Dropbox folder that contains examples of our firm's legal writing. It's not perfect because the fact that, like, as I discussed in the book, your priority as a litigator is to get it done on time, follow the rules, and then kind of work down from there. But you're not creating specimens of perfection. But that said, I am proud of the way we do our filings, and that's why I'm willing to put them out there for people to see as examples. Yeah. Somebody asks, is it fair to summarize the advice about conclusory statements as a statement is not conclusory and acceptable if it both states a legal conclusion and states the key fact or facts that will be used to support the conclusion. I think that's right. As long as, but I did mention, however, that merely juxtaposing the rule and facts is usually not sufficient. You have to usually have to show that the facts fall within the rule, which may require something more than just putting them side by side. Putting them side by side works if it's the speed limit violation example, but in a complicated case like the securities fraud example I provided, you may need to synthesize the rule, characterize the rule accurately, but and based on sound authority, but in a way that encompasses the facts, and then characterize the facts in a way that they fall within the rule. And those all might need to be defended. Judges whose opinions I recommend as models of good reasoning, I would say Judge Easterbrook of the Seventh Circuit is the first that comes to mind. He taught my top academic experience in law school at the University of Chicago Law School was taking a legal interpretation seminar taught by Judge Easterbrook, and really a career-changing event for me in a way. I mean, he's a brilliant writer and his reasoning is brilliant. So to me, he's kind of at the top of the profession in some ways. I think Justice Kagan on the Supreme Court might be another example. Justice Roberts in cases that I agree with him, and which is not always, maybe not even most of the time, but when he's right, he tends to make very good arguments in favor of his position. That's why he features quite a bit in Guberman's book Point Made, for example. But Easterbrook, I would say, would be my go-to both for writing and style and reasoning. And he also taught me the importance of typography, which ultimately planted a seed. And the last chapter of Elegant Legal Writing is about legal document design, how to use which fonts to pick, leaving Type 0 behind, moving on to Palatino Linotype or Century School Book, having wider margins, these kind of things, because judges, they were reading thousands of pages a day or a week, and why not make it easy on their eyes? And that's all I have for today. So I appreciate everyone's time. And I guess there's one last question, which is, can the example writings be made available by email rather than on LinkedIn? I can put them in my blog. I'm not gonna. I'm hundreds of emails behind, unfortunately, so I can't promise to respond to an email. I encourage people to email me if they wish. I just can't promise to be able to respond promptly. But I can put it on the blog, and I'll put it on LinkedIn as well. So I really appreciate everyone's time. I hope that you found this helpful, and I hope you'll continue the conversation with me and take a look at my book and get in touch if you'd like to.
Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did enjoy it, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more videos on law practice and legal marketing. See you in our next clip.